Hello, welcome, and thank you for your attention. My name is Daniel Ari Friedman, and I'm going to be giving this talk alone in one fell swoop in my office, so please excuse any errors of speech. I'm going to be talking about MVEE, a tractable framework for evolutionary studies. The goal of my talk is for you to understand the images on this slide and how they flow naturally from one another. The image on the top right represents my critique of current evolutionary biology, and the image on the bottom left represents MVEE, a theory which builds upon the recent work of Friedman and colleagues to specify more formally eco-evo-devo as a field of biological study. The research question that really motivates me is, how can we formalize, statistically and mathematically, the evolution of heredity, environment, and phenotype through time and across biological levels? While accounting for plasticity and metaplasticity, that is the ability of change to change itself, interactions within and among scales, including my favorite example, ants and the ant colony and neurons in the ant brain, accounting for scientific knowledge, measurement, and modeling constraints, because even with big data, we're still, of course, extremely limited, accounting for biological and ecological variability over behavioral, developmental, and evolutionary time, all of these nested timescales of adaptation, and also accounting for the diversity and open-endedness of evolving systems, including biological, social, computational, etc., different types of systems, the ability of some systems to undergo these massive transitions a la Zas-Marie to new levels of order, the ant colony or the brain, the eukaryotic cell, etc. My goals are twofold. I want to extend variational neuroethology to specify a tractable general framework for all evolutionary studies, biological and otherwise. You may or may not be familiar with variational neuroethology, but I'll explain it later in the talk. This will allow two good things. First, we can better integrate current data across systems. Most meta-analyses in eco-evo-devo are either very limited in their phylogenetic scope, for example, the feeding behavior of a small clade of Drosophila flies, or they're very broad in scope, but often clumped together unlike entities, for example, looking at biodiversity indices as a function of latitude. I think that having a common data type amongst different evolutionary biological systems allows for amazing meta-analysis. For example, having a genome sequence of many, many creatures allowed for unprecedented advances in phylogenomics, and having a similar genomics of behavior, something that we could compare across systems, would allow for a phylobehaviomics or other types of study. This would suggest new measurements that we could make of systems or experiments we've already performed. It would suggest new experiments for us to perform on species that we already are aware of, and it might even suggest new systems for us to discover or invent or design, because these systems might maximally resolve our uncertainty about some aspect of biology. So we could have hypothesis-driven, very rational, discovery-oriented biological research within the framework of reducing our uncertainty about the evolutionary process under a common mathematicized framework. This talk has three parts. In the first background theory section, I will make the claim that eco-evo-devo is trapped in a locally optimizing scientific regime because it's trapped in an incoherent genotype, phenotype, environment, and fitness phrasing, which it happens to have inherited from the modern evolutionary synthesis. In the second background theory part, I'll talk about how the data, theory, math, and philosophy already exist to synthesize a tractable and generalized model of evolution. And then in the third section, I'll briefly sketch out MVEE as a way forward. MVEE is a synergetic framework for evolutionary studies. And for those of you who like to read the Wikipedia page before you see the movie, I'll just tell you that it is basically the summation of variational neuroethology with eco-evo-devo, collective behavior, and machine learning. Brief sip of water. Theoretical background part one. I'm going to define my terms very precisely because I found that much of the history of the so-called debates in biology are actually about nomenclature or about what words mean instead of the deeper implications for what the words might actually mean in a specific or general style. The four words which I want to use a lot in the biological section are genotype, phenotype, environment, and fitness, and usually I'll just put their first letters. Genotype is that which is received. Hashtag all heredity matters, because here I want to refer to genetic as well as epigenetic or otherwise non-genetic, social, it could be informational, to include the broadest possible range of evolving systems. So we can get into physical versus informational transmission, but this is just saying this is the part that persists in some way, sexually, asexually, digitally, or an analog way, informationally. Phenotype is anything that can be measured about the system, whereas environment is anything you can measure about everything you didn't define as your system. Phenotype and environment are thus both defined as real things. They're very detailed, and you might not be able to measure all of them, but they are very real things. And they sort of bleed into one another, especially over various timescales. This accounts for extended phenotype or niche construction type systems, as well as ones where you may only have limited access, or ones like an ant colony, where the physical dirt around the nest becomes as real to its phenotype as does the physiology of a worker's brain. And lastly, we come to fitness. I have a small question mark because, as I'll go into greater detail, I don't really believe in this whole fitness idea, but I would invite you to pause the video and just for a second think if you have a generalized concept of fitness, or whether you're a pluralist and you might think that fitness might be measured best in mammals, but it measures differently in bacteria. The nucleus of all theorizing about these terms is nestled around the kernel of Darwinian evolution. Here is an example of Darwin and his convergently evolved disciple, Daniel Dennett. The three pillars of Darwinian evolution, as I see it, are phenotypic variation, fitness variation, and statistical heredity. Also, these were by Lewontin 1983 called variational principles of natural selection, VNS, and we're going to come back to this. Darwin does speak through his disciples, and in 1995, Dennett wrote a book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, which I think has two great slogans for evolution. Dennett says that you see more successful things, so that is better than survival of the fittest, because fittest implies some sort of strength or brutality, whereas, if you're going to go with a tautological statement, you might as well be more general and more accurate. And lastly, he exhorts us to look for cranes, not skyhooks. That is, for tall buildings, they were put up by cranes that were taken down after the building was completed. And so evolution is a crane builder. It's not a skyhook dropper. There's no deus ex machina. And so that's an explanation for irreducible complexity. And I think that's better than Monod's statement, which is that evolution is a tinkerer, not an inventor, because over different timescales, evolution is certainly an inventor. What the diagram on the left represents is that genotype through the environment becomes phenotype. Phenotype is linked in this Darwinian fashion to fitness, differential success of phenotypes. And then, depending on how genotype and phenotype are linked, whether very tightly or not at all, fitness can feed back on genotype. And that was understood to also involve other population genetic factors like population size. The neo-modern synthesis expanded on these ideas, as well as focusing very much on the infinitesimal, which is an idea of the original modern synthesis that has gotten kind of dropped in subsequent thinking. So here I won't talk about as much the original modern synthesis, so much as the received neo-modern synthesis. In this view, genotype causes phenotype via a mechanistic process called the central dogma. I have environment all the way off to the right because environmental effects are statistically unimportant over developmental or evolutionary time. What I mean by this is that even if an individual scientist believes the environment is important, if you look at the model, for example, of a GTR phylogenetics model, and it assumes heterogeneity of the rate transition matrix, that's an example of where you're saying, well, maybe in the long run, the environment just kind of averages out. So that's the structure of most long-term phylogenetic or evolutionary biology models. Yet, countering this sort of all things being equal, maybe evolution is an averager, on the bottom I have, yet there is a strong historiosity, which is one of the fundamental critiques of writers like Stephen Jay Gould and Lewontin, who discussed things like constraint and contingency and development. So we have simultaneously this tension between thinking about how the environment makes evolution very contingent, limits it very greatly and has a strong historicity, yet somehow we're expected to average those out in long-term models. Lastly, you have this sort of selfish gene or otherwise approach where evolution is change in allele frequency through time, or it could just be change in phenotype to cut the not genetic reductionists a break here. Now, at best, neo-modern work formalizes the relationship between genotype, phenotype, and fitness as a stochastic and nonlinear mapping between these spaces. Again, sometimes environment is considered, other times environment is considered to just drop out of this whole equation. The challenge of this is that you have a very difficult sum-to-sum mapping between two spaces which you'll never actually understand, as well as the fact that the environment is always changing and different alleles can have different fitness effects at different timescales, etc. Critiques which I'll go greater into soon. But there's really two key flaws to this model. The first is that the environment, whether the scientist likes it or not, is relegated to essentially a nuisance parameter over developmental and ecological time. Eco-Evo-Devo, which I'll always use purple to spell out, arises from this first critique that the ecology and development are ignored. However, there is still current disagreement whether Eco-Evo-Devo is a death blow, an update, or a vindication of the modern synthesis. I would recommend the Dennis Noble versus David Sloan Wilson debate, where Dennis Noble attacks and David Sloan Wilson defends the modern synthesis and the current genotype-phenotype fitness paradigm. And it's very interesting. I'm not taking so much a stance here because I think it's clear that people who have thought about this more come to very different opinions. The flaw that I want to focus in on is that the GPF model improperly amalgamates together three empirical spaces, so genotype and phenotype, and then sometimes environment, with one theoretical space. Genotype, environment, and phenotype are all real things. They instantaneously and continuously exist, but fitness fails at some pretty serious spatial measurement, in some pretty serious spatial measurement ways. The fitness of a quote gene, the genome, the individual, the kin, the group, or the species may not be decomposable in any sensible or natural way. So it's not something like a property of a matter where you could say 1 pound plus 1 pound equals 2 pounds. And secondly, even in the literature on fitness, it understands that we can only measure proxies of fitness, never fitness itself. So whether you believe that it's the force that runs the show or not, it's pretty much agreed that fitness doesn't have a specific spatial extent and it doesn't really can't really be measured or exist in the real world. But even worse, especially for theorizing, genotype, environment, and phenotype continuously and actually exist through time. Now you might destroy it with a measurement, but the fact of the matter is it does exist. Fitness fails. Even if you only considered a single proxy of a single spatial level of fitness, for example, SNP frequency of an ant's genome, so just looking only at the one allele level, it's unclear what timescale fitness would apply to, or if it's instantly held by any individual at all. Literal views of fitness, like, well, it's the number of offspring in the next generation, do not deal with long-term effects, game theory, or density dependence, and so we can't simply make a model in which these traits of the system don't exist. So even if you oversimplify by ignoring simple other scales of analysis, such as gene niche or gene culture feedbacks over longer timescales, to say nothing of the historicity of fitness trajectories, even if you ignore this, there's not really any sort of strong argument outside of very contrived systems what spatial or temporal scale fitness exists at. So I think it's fair to say that fitness does not have a definite temporal extent and does not really exist in time either, which makes it sort of a difficulty to theorize in our time-dependent models. The three citations here on the bottom, which I would especially recommend, Darwinizing Gaia, recent paper by Doolittle, as well as Akshay and Von Cleve, whose paper is called There is No Fitness But Fitness and the Lineage is the Bearer. Both are very interesting papers, and Abbott as well, et al. As well, that will kind of stretch your fitness concept if you thought that it was good to use terms such as, oh, well, maybe it's the next number of kin. Now, what really gets me going is that Eco-Evo-Devo, again, I'm in the Ecology and Evolution PhD program, and so Eco-Evo-Devo is near and dear to my heart. Eco-Evo-Devo does actually not escape the second flaw. So I believe that Evo-Devo inherited an intractable GEPF model from the modern evolutionary synthesis. Here are the three real spaces, G, E, and P, moving through space and time, whereas fitness, again, it's not clear where spatially or temporally it's held. So we're trying to formalize models that implicitly ignore one or two of these dimensions, but the fact is that they're not linked in any sensible way. Evo-Devo, I do believe, is a strong improvement from the modern evolutionary synthesis, though again, I don't really care to what extent that it could be said for the field as a whole. I believe that Evo-Devo emphasizes the role of development in the course of genotype becoming phenotype. Here, the keywords I put are developmental biology, collective behavior, multi-level biosystems. For example, understanding how an ant responds to an aggressive non-nestmate, you might need to understand the genotypes and the nutritional state of the colony while the ant was a larva, or you might need to understand the uterine environment of a mammal or their learning. So thinking about development as this ongoing and plastic process by which genotype and phenotype are in discourse, influenced by the environment. That red nucleus of Darwinian fitness still does exist. However, environment is given a much stronger role. Context-dependent fitness effects are given a very strong emphasis. Some people even emphasizing that context-dependent fitness is so prevalent that most evolution, or at least a large amount of it, is functionally neutral, as well as an emphasis on quantifying and theorizing of fitness outcomes and fitness phenotype associations at multiple durations and scales. So saying, well, yes, that individual was not very successful, but its alleles in the long run will do such and such. So multi-scale, multi-time ways to think about phenotype fitness interactions with game theory. And then the process by which fitness through the environment feeds back onto genotype is best described by evolutionary quantitative population genetics and genomics. So here I'm thinking about the work of Professor Dmitry Petrov, for example, looking at artificial selection and how that influences SNP diversity and selection in yeast or in Drosophila. I'm riled up about this because I think that fitness is special and completely different than G, E, and P, and so shouldn't be clustered together with them. Fitness represents the time evolution of the measurable genotype, environment, phenotype triad, exactly analogous to the special role of time in the measurable XYZ triad of classical physics. Studying genotype, phenotype, and fitness as mediated by variation or variability in environment, or like by ignoring it, is like studying height and depth and time as complicated by changes in length. So here on the bottom right, you can see I have an ant, its context, its environment, which is the colony, as well as the plants around it, and then its genome sequence. And we have maybe some data for all of these areas, phenotype, environment, and genotype, moving through time. Those are the only real things that we have. This idea of fitness is more like the idea of time in classical physics. And in fact, most evolutionary models under the GTR, general time reversible class, in other words, almost all of phylogenetics, is done under this reversible framework. And so we have this very strange unilateral feedback loop that apparently only goes forward through time, which is we call fitness. And then all this theory, which is built like an edifice upon the real data, which are just what we know, and it's very limited about phenotype, environment, and genotype through time. So to summarize here, Evo-Devo on the left, I've also added some other complexities. I've added transgenerational epigenetic inheritance so that phenotype feeds back onto genotype directly without fitness intervening. I've added the symbols that I represented the complexity of Evo-Devo with, and I'm just going to bring up the question that has anyone formalized an Evo-Devo system? Even for a very well-studied system, usually we only formalize very small aspects, because we understand that to make a full atom level simulation, for example, even of a small bacterium, is basically outside of the realm of what we want or what we even can do. And so to me, Evo-Devo, while it enriches our understanding of biology, is a little bit backed itself into a corner mathematically because of all these lines that crisscross and this ambiguity about what fitness really is. So my claim for the first background section is that Eco-Evo-Devo does represent an improvement over the neo-modern synthesis, but Eco-Evo-Devo is trapped in a local explanatory optima because it relates genotype, phenotype, environment, and fitness in a framework that is fundamentally impossible to formally solve. This is the genesis of not being able to do meta-analysis across system, is that if every system we have to define the parameters very locally, then we can never make insights that stretch across systems with very different parameters. Okay, second theoretical background section. So some very recent work has been coming out on gauge theories and information entropy in biology. So two bodies of work that I'll highlight. On the right is the title slide of John Baez, who came to speak for our Stanford Complexity Group on April 20th, 2017. He spoke about biology as information dynamics, which is thinking about evolution as a learning process and reformulations of everything from optimal foraging behavior to generational evolution, all these sorts of biological processes as thinking about them in an information theoretic context, and he and many others are working on this area. On the left is a paper by John Campbell in Frontiers in Systems Neuroscience called Universal Darwinism as a Process of Bayesian Inference. And I think the greatest sentence in that one is, at the core of Bayesian inference, underlying both the price equation, which is the multi-level fitness equation, and the principle of free energy minimization, which we'll come back to soon, we find an extremely simple mathematical expression, Bayes' theorem. Now, this can be interpreted in many frames, but to me, it just is exciting to see that all of these previously disparate theories, which were already integrative on their own, are starting to get wrapped together deeper and deeper with better and better tools to understand these systems. A great example of that is the recent work in PLOS Bio by Sengupta et al. And Friedman as the last author there about a neuronal gauge theory. Now, my background is not in gauge physics, so I can read, but I understand that this will fundamentally allow for new types of statistical analysis. And then lastly, to sort of tie the knot together here, Sengupta and Friedman more recently discussed approximate Bayesian inference as a gauge theory. So these people have all worked on the project a lot deeper than I, but I'm bringing this up as the depth of what I understand about the relationship between gauge theory and Bayesian inference, but also just to give you an idea about how recent and hot this field is, as well as how abstract in general and how removed from actual data sets these people are actually working at this point. The paper that I want to focus in on is Variational Neuroethology by Ramstad, Badcock, and Friedman in 2017, and the initials on that paper are RBF, or R. Buckminster Fuller, which we'll come back to later. The paper was called Answering Schrodinger's Question, a Free Energy Formulation, and it builds on the free energy principle, and I'm going to sort of break down what variational neuroethology is. Now, you may be familiar or you may not be familiar, so I'm going to try to keep this short, but also very concise, and it will make more sense if you already have a background in the free energy principle. The free energy principle, very, very briefly, describes how internal and external states are fundamentally coupled through active inference via sensory and action states. And it discusses how organisms minimize the free energy of their world, of their statistical generative world, by optimizing this function on the bottom, which is basically the model complexity, how complicated the model of the world is, and penalization for how deviant expectations are from the model. Variational neuroethology is posing to discuss many biological systems across many orders of magnitude. So here's the obligatory on the top left graph, where you have the 1 millisecond to 1 million year time scale and the 1 millimeter to 1 kilometer spatial scale, and discussing how subcellular processes all the way up to, for example, niche construction fall under the statistical domain of this theory. So this is really awesome, and this is better described on the bottom left, which describes how Markov blankets, which are statistical constructs about the nodes that insulate one part of a system from another, much like a blanket, but maybe a Markov burrito would be more applicable in my case. How these Markov blankets nest inside of one another, like this fractal broccoli, And again, I don't want to go too deep into the mathematical details and don't myself think that they are specifically required for what I'm going to talk about further, but I do believe that their mathematical basis is strong, and I'm interested in seeing how exactly this framework could apply deeper. Variational neuroethology is an evolutionary systems theory about how hierarchically nested Markov blankets performing active inference inextricably, statistically, mechanically link internal and external states through action and perception across biological spatial temporal scales. So that's my one sentence, though long sentence, summary of the paper. What I found super interesting about the paper was that they linked it back to Tinbergen's 4 questions. They say that Tinbergen's levels of inquiry might be apt to elucidate structural laws that supplement the general principles provided by the FEP. Now, Friedman has described the FEP as being a principle on the order of the principle of least action or of the conservation of energy. So in other words, it's a framework that's beyond a theory in that it doesn't make falsifiable predictions. It's more like the umbrella under which science is performed amidst the rain of the real world. So they suggest that we could use Tinbergen's 4 questions or levels of inquiry to develop substantive explanations for the phenotypic traits and behaviors of any species or organism. So in other words, we could use variational neuroethology as our sort of top-down, mathematically rigorous framework, and then we could use Tinbergen's 4 questions to interpret the biological world and say, well, why is the salamander doing that? And why does the salamander go underwater when it sees a bird or something like that? Briefly, Tinbergen's 4 questions were proposed by him in 1963 on that paper on the aims and methods of ethology. And my advisor, Professor Deborah Gordon, is very much focused and continues to teach this sort of classical ethological approach. And so I found it fascinating that that would tie back together with something as quantitative as the free energy principle. On the bottom right is a more recent 2013 paper in Trends in Evolutionary Ecology by Bateson and Lalonde about how the Tinbergen's 4 questions framework has been applied in the intervening 50 years, as well as where it's going in the next years. So this is sort of ongoing current theorizing in evolutionary biology. Briefly, the 4 questions and the levels of inquiry describe how and why, and they're also broken down into contemporary and historical explanations. So ultimately, how something came to be in that organism is a question about development, whereas why it came to be in the organism over very long times is a question about evolution. At the contemporary scale of inquiry, you see that how something happens is the mechanism, for example, how brain regions implement some sort of statistical processing, but the why that they're linked is its question about its function. It may be a little bit lifted from its mechanism. So this is analogous to state and process models. Now, in the paper, they work through only one example. They skip right to the top, right to the most complex system, and they describe how the hierarchically mechanistic mind's evolutionary systems theory can be used within the variational neuroethology framework to study all the scales of human socio-biocultural evolution. So on the left, they have a multi-level brain where there's cortex is performing calculations, and synapses and dendrite trees are making calculations. In the middle, they have more detail on how exactly the top-down, the bottom-up is being implemented across these layers. And on the right is sort of their zoomed-out perspective on what the hierarchically mechanistic mind's formalization looks like. And you can see the underlined red words that the time scale ranges from the neurocognitive, which is our ability, for example, as Bayesian learners at the neuronal level, all the way up through development, phylogeny, and ultimately neuroevolution as a species. So trying to integrate across all these temporal and spatial levels, though with very, very broad equations. Other people are already critiquing and building on this theory, so I am taking up the challenge to adapt the theory to Eco, Evo, Devo more broadly. So here, just for example, the paper was available online in September 2017. It's been about 4 months since then, and it's already at least 12 comments. So I think this is really great and demonstrates how some of these approaches are more or less critical, but they're all very interesting discussions. And so I think that one view that I could add to this discourse is actually a very valuable semi-standalone theory called MVEE. So the two things that I'll point out as where I think the next steps are for me from VNE are that the case study which they present on human cognition is still not really operationalized in a way that allows the usage of actual data. So you might be able to use MRI data to fit one level of analysis, but you don't have MRI data from every species. So you couldn't use, for example, MRI data across those levels. So it still doesn't really help us take the data that we have necessarily and put it into one common meta-analytic framework. And secondly, it's unclear how the VNE approach would be deployed in other arbitrary evolutionary systems, especially using real data. So for example, if I wanted to understand the swimming behavior of a paramecium, or I wanted to explain, as I very much do want to explain, the foraging behavior of ant colonies, it wouldn't be clear, should I just naturally draw lines around what previous people have theorized as the levels of analysis, or should I take a more Latour 2005 ant actor network theory approach, at which point it's not quite clear how we would operationalize the Markov blankets. So just to summarize the theoretical background for MV and the influences that I think play strongest into it. On the top left, I have Darwin, who's telling us to read his disciples. Below him is my advisor, Professor Gordon, whose work I'll come back to at the end of the talk, who emphasizes processes, interactions, and ecological context. The third set of three people is Dirac, the gauge theory inventor, Bayes, and John Bayes, who hilariously have very similar names, who are exhorting us to keep it rational and measurable, then Carl Friston with his free energy framework. Now, what I like about all these scientific theories are that they're pragmatic, they're empirical, they're quantitative, they're pluralistic, they make predictions, and they accommodate complexity. So all of these theories, I think, are A+, and I want to see how they could all strengthen and feed from one another. However, there's sort of a second body of literature that's joined at the hip, especially through authors who do this integral biomathics. And this is often led in the journal Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology by Dennis Noble, or sites like the Third Way of Evolution.com. It tries to integrate new perspectives on math with ways to describe biology. So instead of trying to coerce biology so much as into one common mathematical framework as we currently know numbers, these people are also looking at other ways to think about, for example, east-west fusions, or this is not exactly the focus of the talk, but I just wanted to put references here for people who wanted to pause the video. For integral biomatics specifically, I would recommend the bottom right paper by Simonov, as well as more recent papers by Simonov. But really just flipping through some recent journals of Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology is a very fun experience. And so this work has also influenced me greatly, as much have the more established and mainline scientists who are on this current slide. So I hope that in this talk, I've at least hinted that the data, theory, and philosophy already exist to synthesize a tractable general model of evolution. However, the challenge lies in finding how to integrate the variational neuroethology, again, which claims to explain and predict at every single level of analysis. How do we integrate it with classical evolutionary theory, with eco-evo-devo, and with regular Darwinian evolution, and then apply it to real systems using our limited empirical data? Okay, here we are, the third section of the talk, MV, a way forward. So here I have human knowledge as it progresses up an energy landscape. The first hump was overcome in the 1800s when we understood that species were linked, perhaps in ways that were not specially created or directly linked to how they appeared externally, Lamarck, Darwin, and natural selection. Through the 1920s, we underwent a modern synthesis, which, as I've described earlier, fused genotype, environment, phenotype, and fitness in a way that I think is biologically unnatural. And so that's represented by this overly clean, overly mathematical amalgamate of all four of them in a way that doesn't really make sense. Eco-evo-devo which I would point to perhaps Waddington's work in the 1950s or West Eberhardt's research and textbook in 2003, represents a nice sugary shell around the modern synthesis's core. So it's like a kernel inside. The fitness idea, the idea of genotype, environment, and phenotype being linked through fitness. But Evo has added all of these complexities external to the kernel. For example, transgenerational effects or an emphasis on drift and constraint. And again, I don't think that that's going anywhere because I think that it's fundamentally impossible to formalize, and it's in fact only harder to formalize than the modern evolutionary synthesis, though it at least can deal with real situations better. And so I'm asking, what is next? How could we actually use the beautiful mathematics of variational neuroethology to bring evolutionary studies into the next energy well? So just to do a little graphical layout here, Tinbergen's 4 questions, evolutionary systems theory, and eco-evo-devo fused to make eco-evo-devo. That's the best, in my opinion, the state of biological thought. Now, evolutionary systems theory, Tinbergen's 4 questions, and the free energy principle fused together to make variational neuroethology. So I'm taking the natural step to fuse those two to make a theory which I'm calling MV. Now, bolstering this network, and not to make it too complex, but collective behavior feeds into both eco-evo-devo and MV, but not variational neuroethology in an explicit manner, as well as synergetics, which via Haken in 1983 feeds into variational neuroethology, but I'm actually going to use synergetics in the way that Buckminster Fuller specified it in his book, Explorations in the Geometry of Thinking, and also bring in machine learning, which is not explicitly specified in either of those frameworks. MV stands for multi-level variational evolutionary ecology. Now, variational in the term's name, in the Darwinian sense, refers to natural variation. For example, the way that Richard Lewontin used it in his 1983 paper. And so he actually used the word variational to describe what Darwinian evolution was, because it was selection on variation. However, as you may know, variation is also technically used to refer to variational, that is, ensemble Bayesian models, for example, in the variational free energy principle, VFEP. So MV is kind of a joke because it uses variational in a way that actually ties these fields together in a way that was parallel before. Also, MV has another meaning, which is minimum viable evolutionary explanation. And so I'm not going to use that definition anymore, but it turns out that multi-level variational evolutionary ecology is the way that you can figure out how to specify the minimum viable explanation, which I think is the most parsimonious or statistically optimal way to describe a system given the constraints of your knowledge. So brief questions. Is MV consistent with prior biological theory? Yes, I think that MV at its worst or its least specific would be at worst equivalent to eco-evo-devo at its best. Is MV a gauge theory? Yes, it only deals with observables and follows RBF 2017. Again, I'm not a gauge theory physicist, but I just know that my thinking follows RBFs very closely, and so in that sense, I can't imagine how it's not a gauge theory. Can MV deal with theoretical, that is, analytical evolution? For example, simple game theory or perhaps computer string evolution? Yes, and for some of these formal systems, there may even be an atemporal solution, an analytical solution to solve. Can MV deal with this empirical or open evolutionary systems? Yes, for open evolutionary systems in their past and in their future, we can at least provide statistically optimal estimates and maximally informed hypotheses about these systems. And last question, what is the computational architecture of MV? By using a single integrated machine learning framework on pre-existing biological data, which I think would be probably the TensorFlow or compute graph framework, MV jointly and optimally considers coarse-grained state and process models across scales. And so I'll go into more detail on that now. The first thing is that fitness doesn't exist. We are free at last. We no longer have to talk about fitness. We're only going to talk about measurable things. The things that you can measure are genotype, environment, phenotype, and time, and that's it. So it's kind of like X, Y, and Z. and time in physics, there's no how I feel as another imaginary fifth dimension. And there's two kinds of models that both sort of stem from this MVEE nexus. There's state models and there's process models. The state models I'll describe first, then the process models. For the state models, the motto is use what works. So to understand how phenotype maps onto phenotype at a later time, that is, for example, within the same generation or between generations, would be developmental biology and quantitative genetics. To understand how the environment is related to the environment at a future time, you could just look at, depending on the time scale, global climate change or smaller scale factors. And to understand how genotype is related to genotype at a later time, we already have state models such as evolutionary genetics. But also, you can do how phenotype at one time point combines or is related to environment at a future time point. That's like niche construction. You could ask how the environment at one point influences the phenotype at a later point. That's plasticity. It could be 8 hours later. It could be 8 generations later. And then you could ask how DNA models are mapped onto states of one another, and just ask in a statistically maximal way, what can I say about the models of DNA evolution? Also, of course, you could have how do phenotype and environment combine, et cetera, et cetera. Now, asking at the developmental level how genotype through environment is related to phenotype is development, and asking how that process is changing through time is metaplasticity, or the sort of between generational developmental constraints of eco, evo, devo. And so here, and I'll get into the mathematical phrasing of these models soon. But this is just to say that MVEE focuses on, here in the state model section, only the observables and how they're linked, and tries to find the statistically optimal way to determine how genotype, environment, and phenotype are linked at different times, and then describes the evolution of that mathematical construct instead of appealing to an external variable called fitness. The process model is collective behavior, and this is, again, the specialty of my advisor, Professor Gordon. The keywords here are that all computation is local, but of course, local scales are nested within other local scales. That predictive and adaptive logic often become the norm. That's cybernetics. There's many other fields that draw on this idea. That there are multi-level feedback loops, for example, between gene and niche, or culture and individual. That there's a certain robustness and evolvability trade-off that is inherent in being alive. And this emphasis on emergence and self-organizational properties of cells or of ants. The questions here, instead of saying, well, what is the state? What do we measure? What variable can we what static variable can we measure, which is the emphasis of state processes. The process models in collective behavior ask questions like, what is the algorithm here? What does each agent perceive? What does each agent do? And how do group outcomes arise? How do they influence individual behavior? Now, I'm not going to focus too much on this part of the talk, but there is a supplemental appendix, which I will just briefly flash through at the end after I finish my main argument. But I will just say here, drawing from two papers in 2014 and 2016 by Professor Gordon, that formalizing the decentralized process implies formalizing the environmental dynamics. So just like how I brought up in the very beginning that ultimately environment and phenotype had to be considered to bleed into one another, especially over long timescales, and then here we can use collective behavior as our sort of knife to cut through nature at the joint and understand how the collective behavioral algorithm, that is the Umwelt and the affordances, what can the organism perceive, what can it do, as well as how is it collectively related to others like it. All these big questions in collective behavior, that's sort of our way to cut through the system of observables. So again, the observables are genotype, environment, and phenotype, and they're being associated through time by collective behavioral algorithms. And then that process of observables, we're only partially observing. Now, you may be familiar with a tensor, which is a generalization of an array. But here you can see that, like the image on the left, I've shown how genotype, environment, and phenotype, the observables, which are actually real things, are being linked in a way that looks like fitness through time. But actually, this whole system is time-free. It's the time is, or I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's not time-free. It's time-specified, and it's fitness-free. And then if you chose to say, I wonder what the frequency of this allele was between 2000 and 2010, that's a question you could ask. But at no point fitness comes into the equation. You can just ask about how things change through time in a way that's quantifiable instead of just being ad hoc. So I've specified it in the same mathematical language as the image, which is that biology is basically just consisting of the tensor evolution of genotype, environment, and phenotype through time. This would be a dynamic, generalized, multi-scale tensor representation of any evolving system. And I think it could be implemented on processes like TensorFlow and R. So I'm trying to be brief here with the mathematical details, but actual data could be used. For example, the G could be the genotype, and already people have used extensive machine learning on just genotype. The E could be information about the environment, but real information across environments. The P could be various measurements or summaries of measurements. Then, for any scale of analysis, you also have other sorts of information, for example, the phylogenetic tree. But all of this can be pushed through a machine learning framework, and given the ways of thinking about collective behavior to sort of smooth the differences. For example, the collective process of transcription we know something about. So we could use our knowledge of transcription to sort of find the best models that relate genotype to cellular phenotype. Or if we know something about ant foraging, we might be able to use our information about what ants can perceive and the neurophysiology there to make the optimal statements about ant foraging. And if it turns out that the error estimates are very large, so in other words, that we can't say what the ancestral ant foraged like, or we can't say what the ancestral ribosome looked like, then I believe that this representation at least would specify that uncertainty in a way where previous models, or current models, should I say, actually overspecify their confidence because they use parametric models, which is a well-known problem in inference. For example, Gelman's work discussing how Bayesian priors and parametric analyses can both lead to severely inflated significance estimates. So I think that this phrasing is sort of the most general phrasing, is the most general frame holder for all of our real biological data from things that can directly be compared across all clades like the genome sequence, but as well as to things like the genome entropy. That would allow comparison of, for example, E. coli's genome to a computer virus genome. So then you could have a tensor that only consisted of the genotypic information at a summary level, or TensorFlow can be used on data that is partially missing. So we could use an autoencoder, and then we could ask what experiments or measurements would optimally resolve our uncertainty. And so just to do one last math slide, I would just make a slight E equals MC squared pun and suggest that evolution is described by this idea of a multi-level variational evolutionary ecology construct tensorized through time. Okay, that's the end of the talk. I'm going to give a summary in 2 breaths. The first point is that eco, evo, devo is a mess and can never be formally, mathematically, or statistically described. Then I described a theory called MVEE, multi-level variational evolutionary ecology, drawing on many sources to potentially overcome some of these fundamental weaknesses in current evolutionary studies. So with that, this is the visual and mathematical as well as conceptual foundations of the theory on one slide. The 3 appendices, which I'm not going to go into, are about collective behavior, synergetics, and gauge theory and coarse graining. And I can probably do those at a later date if required, but I thought that I would keep the actual argument very, very direct for now. So please let me know your thoughts, and I look forward to hearing back from you. Thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it, and also appreciate your privacy with this video. Thank you.